It is a well-known fact that swords are cool, and so, whether it's in a high fantasy setting or a more historical context, getting to swing a sword around is the actual best thing ever. In fact, a significant amount of the most complex entertainment medium around is dedicated to the simulation of getting to play with very pointy sticks. This is, in part, thanks to combat being the most straightforward method of conveying conflict in a story, and one that could be creatively linked to gameplay. But it's also important to consider the fact that if you put a sword in your game, I am roughly 1,000,000 times more likely to play it. So, melee combat in various forms has been a staple in video game design for a long time. However, it is very difficult to design a system that takes this concept and delivers an experience that is truly cathartic and satisfying. From the original Legend of Zelda right up to AAA hack-and-slash brawlers, developers have iterated and innovated on systems that take different approaches and face different challenges when trying to translate the intricate complexity of martial arts into gameplay that is both intuitive and rewarding. The first and most obvious approach to melee combat in games is to have the player so disconnected from any sort of martial simulation that gameplay essentially boils down to press button do sword. And that statement of the gameplay simplicity is in no way a slight on the game's design. In fact, it is through relative simplicity that developers have managed to create some of the most engaging and moorish core loops in all of gaming. You can see this in Zelda games and arcade-style titles like Ninja Gaiden or Dynasty Warriors, but a more contemporary example is the adrenaline-pumping action of Hades. By removing the focus from the actual usage of weaponry and instead opting to have the acts of dodging and strategic attack placement take centre stage, by the end of an encounter, the player still feels like they've conquered a room full of enemies, even though the combat is handled largely by mashing a couple of buttons. The satisfaction of the system doesn't come from the simulation of actual combat, but rather from the overall gameplay experience. This is because through straightforward no-fuss combat, the game could throw challenges of epic proportions at you, without you feeling like a little baby holding a sword who's about to get smushed. But what if the arcadey gameplay and hyper-stylized combat of games like Hades doesn't really scratch your itch? What if you want that little sword baby feeling, and having to fight your way through the game by mastering a more involved system is exactly the kind of gritty experience you're looking for? Well, then you have games like Dark Souls. With its greater focus on weapon usage and relatively more grounded approach to combat, many gamers feel this iconic series is the ultimate action RPG. Although, for many, even the unforgiving gameplay of Dark Souls is still too distant from the rapid tactical decision-making of martial arts, and the overall stunted nature of the system lacks the complexity necessary for swordplay to feel dynamic and expressive. For those players, the industry has created systems more akin to fighting games in execution. On the more casual side of things, you have games like For Honor, a hack-and-slash hero brawler that's largely unique in its approach to melee combat. For Honor presents a system that relies on 3 stances and a mixture of light and heavy attacks, as well as feints and parries. This is a lot closer to a simulation of actual swordplay, and the game offers many different playstyles and weapons to use in its characters, and puts an emphasis on visual presentation and customization. The system is fun and engaging to play, and landing attacks feels really meaty through excellent sound and visual design, with just enough tactical depth to make winning rewarding. For Honor is mostly focused on team-based game modes, with plenty of accommodations made to allow you to hold your own against 4 opponents and still have a chance of winning, which feels amazing if you can pull it off. If you want an experience that allows you to take more control over combat than most games do, but it's still very much casually focused and easy to pick up and chill out with, For Honor offers something you really don't see often. However, while it can be fun, especially with friends, the system is not optimised for serious one-on-one dueling gameplay, and when pushed into that role, it quickly starts showing its limitations. If you're looking for something more complex and serious, you might look towards more traditional fighting games. You could look at Soul Calibur, the most popular and widely renowned weapon-based fighting game. Although Soul Calibur is very much a fighting game first and foremost, with very little focus placed on the actual usage of martial weaponry. It's a super fun game and is a widely respected esport, but it isn't exactly a great example for what we're looking for here. A closer translation of martial arts into a fighting game is the much more recent indie title Hellish Quart. What it might lack in overall gameplay experience available when compared with games like For Honor, it makes up for with a robust one-on-one fencing system that is being heralded by many as the best of all time. That's not to say it isn't still pretty janky, but the punishing gameplay based on actual historical fencing techniques with a variety of swords makes Hellish Quart a really interesting game for anyone looking for a complex multiplayer experience. In fact, it might just be the very best option available at the moment if you want a game that allows you to really start to understand and apply actual fencing theory. However, the biggest problem Hellish Quart and games like it face is that the third-person perspective disconnects the player from the character's actions, so that it cannot function as an immersive simulation of martial combat. If you, like me, are at all interested in historical European martial arts, or HEMA for short, then the game system is more than intricate enough to deserve your attention, but it will always feel more like watching a fencing bout than actually participating in one. If you really want to make an immersive experience, the only option is to make a game first person. So how about a game like Skyrim? Maybe not. How did we collectively decide to spend roughly bajillions of hours playing a game whose combat looks like this? You just rub up on people and press right trigger until they fall over. It's certainly an approach to combat, and it is in what's widely considered one of the best games ever. But while the first-person perspective certainly makes you feel closer to the action, it isn't exactly the most exhilarating gameplay experience. A much better example would be games like Mordhau and the more recent Chivalry 2. While these games don't have the close realism of Hellish Quart, their first-person melee combat is incredibly chunky, and the feinting and parrying-based gameplay is still fun and rewarding. Of course, the infinite complexity of fencing is rather difficult to accurately represent in a way that intuitively translates to a controller command system, especially when you're trying to do it in 3 dimensions. It is much easier to simplify it into a third-person fighter. However, the freedom of movement alone in a first-person game goes miles towards giving players the feeling of being right in the action and really connected to the combat experience. These games are also very much focused on large-scale battles, and go a long way to trying to immerse the player in the gritty, muddy realism of close-up warfare. Although, similar to what happened with For Honor, these systems sacrifice realism for gameplay that is more accessible, and to be fair, they've done it really well, and those games are great fun. A more accurate analogue of armed martial arts in a first-person game requires significantly more complexity to the system, and will inevitably lead to a more demanding gameplay experience. This can be seen in Warhorse Studios' historical epic, Kingdom Come: Deliverance. The game features a combat system that takes heavy inspiration from historical treaties and iconography to deliver the closest experience to actual fencing with a variety of weaponry that I've ever seen. With accurate stances, movements and strikes, the game gives a close impression of being in an actual skilled duel. Though, of course, the commitment to realism is a massive undertaking, and the system in Kingdom Come can seem unreasonably obtuse and difficult to handle for some players. If you really give it a go and spend some time with the game, eventually you settle into the rhythm of the combat and might find yourself really enjoying what it has to offer. Even fights that are hugely pitched against you are winnable, and overcoming those challenges can be really satisfying. Unfortunately though, even in its successes as one of the most sophisticated melee systems ever made, Kingdom Come really highlights some of the inherent limitations of the medium. Controlling a character on a screen in a fight can never allow you the expressiveness or control over your actions that you really want, as can be seen in the fact that Kingdom Come has to rely on a series of combos in order to initiate any sort of complex offensive movement, and even then, the game can still give players the sense of fighting underwater or in a dream due to the rather floaty animations. Other than the obvious fact that a controller or keyboard doesn't exactly handle the same as a polearm, the biggest difficulty of making a first-person melee combat system is overcoming the problems of depth perception and feedback. Of course, games can let the player know whether they've hit their target or not through their presentation. See the bone-crunching impact of every swing in Mordhau. But judging measure, the term used to describe distance from an opponent in HEMA, as well as the movements of your opponent's weapon and how they affect your own, are key parts of fencing that are almost impossible to accurately represent on a screen. And so, as is the case for all of gaming, if you want a truly immersive and dynamic experience, then the future is VR. The strengths of VR for making melee-centric gameplay are pretty obvious. You exist in a 3D space and are allowed direct control over the motion of your hands. There's even a degree of actual real-life movement that can be employed to make the experience feel more real. All this goes towards allowing the player to control an in-game weapon in an approximation of how they would a real one, instead of having to translate their actions through a control scheme. This has already been used to great effect in some incredibly entertaining games, like the cartoonish gorefest Gorn. This game is a super fun arcade experience, but isn't exactly the sophisticated fencing simulation we're looking for. Obviously, VR has amazing implications for simulating martial arts of any kind, not just armed ones. But before we get the perfect swashbuckling digital experience we're all dreaming of, there are some kinks to work out first. If we take a look at one of the most popular VR S-word sim games, Blade and Sorcery, we can see that great fun can be had using various forms of weaponry with a level of dexterity and control much closer to what you would have in real life. You could even use the game to practice drills and techniques you may have learned in a martial art, or just pick up a warhammer and wail on a bunch of enemies. But even VR in its current state holds limitations for simulating the use of melee weapons. While it does allow you to use your own hands to control weapons, it cannot properly simulate their weight, which is a significant part of proper control and handling, and lend swings that meaty impact feeling people look for in games. Even the use of dynamic handheld controllers is limited in its effectiveness when simulating combat. The fact that the two controllers are always necessarily disconnected makes using the two hands in unison, like when you're using a two-handed weapon, feel incredibly clumsy. Then, the lack of any appreciable feedback or resistance in targets means your swings will always feel limp, and the fact that you can simply move your hands past the point of contact with any object presents a jarring disconnect that absolutely kills immersion. So, VR is an absolutely incredible way to scratch any melee combat itches you may have, but there is still a little room to grow. Though, with the advancements made by dedicated and talented developers, we may soon see a game with a next to perfect combat simulation. I hope these crazed, nerdy ramblings have managed to get across that swords are cool, games about swords are cool, and different approaches to combat systems can offer different experiences and are all beautiful in their own way. Please let us know your thoughts on combat in games and your favourite examples in the comments. I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, please leave a like, and if you want you can share this video anywhere you want, because it really helps me out. There are plenty of other videos on the channel you might enjoy as well, so you can subscribe, ring the bell and follow me on Twitter for updates. For now though, thank you again for watching and have a wonderful day. Bye!